Friends.
Shi Ching 604 said doomed.
Kafka. Are we alive? New matter-of-fact cynicisms and stories about the difficulties of life. Since then, 10 years have gone by. We saw absolutely straight paths. Relentless reality came and made them crooked. Nevertheless, things are moving forward. It is a matter of tactics, my dear. Matter-of-fact cynicisms and stories about the difficulties of life. Since then, 10 years have gone by. We saw absolutely straight paths, relentless reality. In me grows a tiny feeling against dichotomies. Strong, weak, big, small, happy, unhappy, ideal, not ideal. It is only because people cannot think more than two things. More does not fit into a sparrow's brain. The healthiest thing is simply maneuver. If the revolutionary period had been a time of abrupt contrasts and absolute alternatives, in which black and white reigned, 10 years later, a game of gray and gray nuances, complicated to excess, ruled. By 1928, the people of November 1918 had long since become caught up in the shoving of hard facts and the lesser evil. An all-pervading moral and tactical relativism gnawed away on older images of identity. Literary expressionism had been a final rearing up of the will to simplify, an uprising of modern means of expression against modern experiences, against complexity, relativity, perspectivism. By contrast, the Cubist tendency in painting seemed adequate to modernity in that it took account of the experience that things looked different from different perspectives. In the age of tactics, advertising, propaganda, a Cubist mentality becomes a general fact of intelligence. With it, from now on, older models of identity and character seem archaic and folkloric, if not narrow-minded. Under such circumstances, it becomes an existential problem how what tradition called the humane can be saved from a total emptying and destruction. It is, to use Thomas Mann's words, the suffering and greatness of late bourgeois art, that it let itself in for the torment of such questions and the psychopolitical perceptions that force one to them. I want to try to describe some of these perceptions and, with their help, to render intelligible the meaning and the painfulness of such questions about the humane and the inhumane. In doing so, I initially work with some very bold abstractions that are meant to clarify the modern splitting apart of systems and sensibilities. Weimar's social character was formed under the pressure of a threefold front of complexity. The first front imposed itself on the contemporaries as a downright depressing confusion of political structures and power relations. What has been investigated as anti-democratic thinking in the Weimar Republic, Sontheimer and others, is only the tip of the iceberg of social skepticism and private reservations about politics. In it, there was a component of reason that, to the present day, cannot be overlooked. All right. I tell the tale that I heard told. Booyah. Who would have told such a tale, or told that they would tell of such a tale? Or told that they had heard tell, they would tell that they had heard tale of a tale. Let's say Dickens. Terrence, this is stupid stuff. You eat your victuals fast enough. There can't be much as clear to see the rate you drink your beer. But oh good lord, the verse you make, it gives a chap the bellyache. Cow, the old cow, she is dead. It sleeps well, the horned head. Gossamer. Part 2 of what? Oh, look at that. Wow. What is this beastly poem? Casa Guidi windows? I heard last night a little child go singing 'neath Casa Guidi windows by the church O bella libertà, O bella. Stringing the same words still on notes he went in search so high for, you concluded the upspringing of such a noble bird to sky from perch must leave the whole bush in a tremble green, and that the heart of Italy must beat while such a voice had leave to rise serene. And now this doesn't work. Ugh, God. Technical mazes just never cease. Okay, let me try this audio monitor here. Doesn't work either. It should work. Doesn't work at all. Oh, I can't hear anything. Whoa. Oh, it's because the volume's down, good lord. Yes? Yes. Okay, and this is even without the audio monitor. So you hear the child go singing. O bella libertà, O bella. Stringing the same words, still on notes he went in search so high for. You concluded the upspringing of such a nimble bird to sky from perch must leave the whole bush in a tremble green, and that the heart of Italy must beat, while such a voice had leave to rise serene twixt church and palace of a Florence street. A little child too, who not long had been by mother's fingers steadied on his feet, and still, O bella libertà, he sang. Then I thought, musing, of the innumerous sweet songs which still for Italy outrang from older singers' lips who sang, not thus exultingly and purely, yet with pang, fast sheathed in music, touched the heart of us so finely that the pity scarcely pained. I thought how Felicia led on others, bewailers for their Italy enchained, and how they called her childless among mothers, widows of empire, aye, and scarce refrained cursing her beauty to her face, as brothers might ashamed sisters. Had she been less fair, she were less wretched. How, evoking so, from congregated wrong and heaped despair of men and women, writhing under blow, harrowed and hideous in a filthy lair. Some personating image wherein woe is wrapped in beauty from offending much. They called it Cybele or Niobe, or laid it corpse-like on a bier for such, where all the world might drop for Italy, those cadenced tears, which burn not where they touch. Juliet of nations, canst thou die as we? And was the violet crown that crowned thy head so overlarge, though new buds made it rough, it slipped down and across thine eyelids did, O sweet, fair Juliet? Of such songs enough, too many of such complaints. Behold instead, void at Verona, Juliet's marble trough. As void as that is, are all images men set between themselves and actual wrong, to catch the weight of pity, meet the stress of conscience, since 'tis easier to gaze long on mournful masks and sad effigies, than on real, live, weak creatures crushed by strong. Galileo. Queer. has been denied, but it cannot be disproved that after, as during the time of the interdict, there is a strong inclination on the part of many Venetians to disentangle themselves from some of the innovations of the Jesuits and other modern teachers of the Church of Rome. They wished more liberty of conscience. They purchased the Italian Bible whenever they had the opportunity. They desired their church to be less fettered and looked for its return to its ancient usage. They were attracted by and interested in the sermons of Fra Paolo, the two Fulgenzios, Marsilio, and the other theologians, the seven. They had greedily perused the writings during the interdict. These had exposed much that required to be known, and intelligent minds discovered that there was not that impassable gulf between the Church of Rome and the Church of Rome Reformed, as was alleged. There were many observances and abuses of the Church which only belonged to ignorance. Their affections were touched by the magnitude of the love of the Savior, and as this, Paolo tells us, was the theme on which the preachers dwelt, it is not marvelous what he relates of the numbers who hung on the lips of Fulgenzio Macanzio. Those who have listened to the impassioned language of the priests of Italy to a throng of worshippers can best picture to themselves Fra Paolo or Fra Fulgenzio, with all the bold eloquence of truth addressing the hearts and understandings of the crowd, who were loyal to their prince and had shown themselves willing to follow him in his recent protest against Rome. It is a well-authenticated fact, on one occasion when preaching from the words of the Holy Savior to the Jews, "Have ye not read?" Fra Fulgenzio added, "If the Savior were now to ask the question, 'Have ye not read?' all the answer you would make would be, 'No, we are forbidden to do so.'" And it is a fact equally vouched for that when the Church resounded with the same demand that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, made to the Holy Savior, "What is truth?" Fra Fulgenzio took a New Testament from his pocket and told his auditors that after long search he had found it there. He held the precious volume up with outstretched hands in the sight of all. "But," he exclaimed, as he returned the book to its place, "the book is prohibited." The effect of these words can scarcely be described. They stirred the assembly to its depths. Fra Paolo and Fulgenzio were of the same opinion as the learned Brucciolo, who told the Duke of Tuscany that the reading of the Holy Scriptures was of all means the most calculated to make his people devout men and dutiful subjects. There can be no doubt but that at that time, and after the interdict, many copies of the Holy Scripture entered Venice, but these volumes were soon strictly prohibited. The adherents of Rome prevented their entrance, and the people were forced to be content with the portions of Holy Writ contained in their books of common prayer. An associate of Fra Paolo, the secretary of Sir Henry Wotton, must have had full opportunity of judging the truth of the above statements, thus expresses himself. Venice is like a new world. It is the greatest consolation to find oneself in companies and assemblies at the houses of the nobles, and to hear them speak with such piety and zeal of the truth of God, with those good men, Father Paolo, Fulgenzio, and Beadle, chaplain of the ambassador. The sermons in public are as good as could be preached in Geneva, and they are delivered with so much earnestness that crowds flock to hear them. It is necessary to go very early to be in time to get a place. The Inquisition is kept under by a senator who is a member of it, and without whose voice nothing can be decided. He is always chosen from the greatest opponents of the Pope. The vehemence against the Pope in court is greater than ever, and Jesuits were denounced from the pulpit, their doctrines refuted and denied, and they mortally disliked. Many of the nobles had provided themselves with tutors of the Reformed religion. 3/4 of the nobility are much attached to the truth, and the rest favorably inclined. Here may be seen what reform within the Church of Rome can do. Not only the nobles, but the citizens and people heard Fra Paolo and Fulgenzio gladly. The dislike of the Jesuits grew the stronger because they still endeavored to harass Venetia, and therefore it was not malice but love of his country that still stimulated Fra Paolo against them. He was particularly shocked by one of their writings sent to him from France, and boldly says, "Such things would not be endured in Italy." Since their banishment, he knew that they were secretly occupied against church and state, and that they were not so much feared as they had been, which he regretted. Next to religion, the most prominent topic in Fra Paolo's correspondence is freedom. He was gratified by Monsieur Gillot's interest in the liberty of the Church. I will not say he writes of the Gallican, but of the universal Church, and perhaps in this age God wills by a milder method than that adopted in the last to annihilate tyranny. The foundation was then attempted to be laid, but it was incomplete. Who knows, but this may succeed better. If God blesses the work, we may have hope. The familiar nature of Sarpi's correspondence is thus expressed by himself. I write to you without taking much account of what I say, as if I spoke to you, but such is my habit, because familiar letters ought to be the dictate of the heart without affectation. In a letter without date, but evidently prior to this period, he remarks that Fra Fulgenzio Manfredi had left Venice for Rome. He had been seduced by emissaries of the Pope and had yielded after 2 years' persecution, had been provided with a safe conduct from the nuncio at Venice, had gone through the patrimony of the church, and had been met and congratulated on his way. On his arrival he was maintained, provided with 3 servants by the Pope, and received an audience, while the general of the Jesuits was kept waiting for 2 hours. But Sarpi knew how to estimate these passing honors. What will come of this time will show, but possibly it will be seen hereafter that he who is believed by some to be infallible may be so in this also. He also knew that Manfredi could not give any information to the court of Rome that would injure the Republic, and it was the common opinion that his life would be short. About this time, command had been given to Michael Viti and Parasio, both Sarpi's assassins, to leave Rome, and the latter was imprisoned a second time at Ancona. I am very cautious, Sarpi writes, more to defeat their wishes than for any esteem I have of myself. The court of Rome and the head of it have not forgotten that we could not acknowledge his omnipotence, which is the greatest sin that can be committed against them. They long for revenge, and they spare neither pains or trouble to return to the old way. For most of his correspondence, like the mind of Sarpi, was cheerful. He looked on events with the eye of one who referred all to the all-wise and almighty ruler of the universe. He did not pretend to fathom mysteries, to foretell future events, or to question the right of God to do what and as he willed. His great intellect bowed to the divine with childlike submission. His letters are filled with short but devout aspirations of trust in God, and seeing impiety successful, he betrays no surprise, only observing, "It is what is predicted by the Holy Spirit, and is for the fulfillment of holy prophecy. We ought to be compassionate to one that is blind, unless he is willfully so. I have always observed that nothing more precipitates danger than too great avoidance of it." Here Sarpi evidently alludes to the constant warnings of his friends to be aware of danger, as he continues, after observing that affairs in Venice went very ill. "But I am too much occupied with a certain conceit of others to take care of myself, because I trust wholly to God, except when the discourse of others forces me to think of it. It's a strange thing that they still try to seize me, even in my own chamber." Here's the sentence. 15 days since, someone went into the Colonna Palace to apprehend Poma. He defended himself by killing one of the sbirri and wounding others. He was wounded in the body, as also his son. They are now in prison. I do not comprehend these mysterious doings. There must be some hidden art in them which I do not understand. This is his only comment. The court of Rome had determined that the works of Baronius should be defended. This was contrary to Sarpi's strictures on the cardinal's work, and he was grieved to see Italy largely supplied with pamphlets full of untruth. Afraid of their works being prohibited, their authors published them as if written on another subject than that of which they treated. He had perused the King of Great Britain's answer to Bellarmine, took notice of the catalogue of the Jesuits, in which there are names of all the houses and colleges, those which they formerly possessed in Venice, are marked thus, and underneath is written, Notata nundum recurpate sunt. If they say this with a vow, he adds Sarpi, that they will return thither. They are very bold, but perhaps God will be for us. I hope so. Esto Perpetua, recalled by John Adams in 1820 to Thomas Jefferson. Davila. Señor. Mostrándose verdadero Hijo de la gloria de su bienaventurado Padre, en el principio de su dichoso reinado me mandó escribir la historia de sus inmortales hechos. Suplicó la reciba como fruto de mi leal obediencia y la considere como espejo, donde mirándose conservará en su real ánimo la veneración debida a tan gran Padre no difunto, sino vivo en el corazón de vuestra merced. arte donde se aprende el más dificultoso de todos, haciendo ponderación de lo pasado para disponer con suavidad lo presente. Y me prometo que si causa gusto en vuestra merced el escuchar las historias de otros reyes, mayor se le causará el oír lo que tanto y tan de cerca le toca. Y ensalce Dios con nuevos trofeos y triunfos el nombre, fama, felicidad y grandeza de vuestra merced, para que con su poderoso brazo defienda la Iglesia Santa, deshaciendo los intentos de los que vanamente se muestran enemigos de su verdad y poder. Underlying Sarpi's hostility to universalism was always his profound belief that the lofty principle it appeared to embody was in reality only an instrument of the perennial imperialism of Rome. Rome, with good reason, recognized that its true enemy was the political mentality of the Renaissance. Henry IV had been annoyed by the controversy and thought that both sides had brought on an Iliad of inconveniences for a Helen of so little merit that all past history reveals no example of Christendom being troubled for a thing so trifling. In addition, his conception of their predicament may be seen as an illustration of a problem with which Renaissance political speculation was centrally concerned. Predicament of the man of virtu, here clearly virtuosity rather than virtue, contending with circumstances that threaten to destroy him. I offer to your majesty's view the truest and most judicious ecclesiastical history that either modern times or any antiquity hath afforded to the world, impaired, I confess, in beauty, as being transported out of the natural luster both of style and phrase by a rude and unskilful translator, but nothing altered in the truth and sincerity of the matter which it handleth. The author, a stranger to these parts, conversant only where the gospel cannot be truly preached, was moved to write it, as for the common good of all Christendom, so particularly in contemplation of your majesty's service. For, as you hold the highest place among all kings and princes, and are God's greatest lieutenant under the whole cope of heaven, so your admirable perfections of wisdom, learning, justice, and religion, with which your royal breast is enriched beyond all comparison to be made with any other, cast forth their bright shining rays into all countries and quarters of the world, and rouse up the endeavors of the worthiest, even in places the farthest remote, to labor in the building up or repairing of God's church, so far as the tyranny of Antichrist, under which they live, and the safety of their lives, which nature binds them to preserve, doth give them leave. In which number is the author of this present treatise, the end and scope whereof being the glory of God, by discovery of those practices which for many years have been concealed by the enemies of Christ, the advancement of true piety and religion. I know not to whom it may be addressed more justly than to the greatest majesty upon the whole surface of the earth, and the chiefest defender of the true faith amongst us. And surely if ever any book, except only the Book of God, did deserve the protection of so excellent a patron, it is this history of the Council of Trent. For of all the things in the world, religion is of the greatest consequence, and in religion, ecumenical councils, next after the Holy Writ, have ever carried the greatest sway, which being true and guided by the Holy Ghost, have been causes of infinite blessings, but being pretended only and governed by humane policies and art, have brought forth as many mischiefs and afflictions to the Church of God. Now in this of Trent it is plainly discovered that the bishops of Rome, of whom 8 lived and died during the time of the synod and treaty thereof, instead of being Christ's holy vicars, as they pretend, have been the greatest and most pernicious quack-salving jugglers that ever the earth did bear. It would be infinite to relate the stratagems they used to divert before it began, their postings to and fro to hinder the proposing of those things which they thought to diminish their profit or pull down their pride, their policies to enthrall the prelates and divines by hopes and fears, their diligence in sending their adherents to Trent, and so by procuring a major part of voices, to make themselves the absolute lords of all the determinations that passed. By which devices that which was desired by godly men is the only remedy against all the errors in manner and doctrine, both in church and commonwealth, and especially against the greatest enormities of the popes themselves, and wrested to quite a contrary use, to weaken the lawful rights of kings and princes, to pervert the doctrine and hierarchy of the Church of God, and to lift up the papacy to an insufferable height of pride. This is that holy and great synod of which the Romanists do boast themselves so much. And indeed every one of any mean capacity may easily know that many controverted points between them and the true professors, necessary as they maintain for the saving of men's souls, had never any colorable establishment but this, which insensibly creeping in by the superstition of the vulgar, or secretly set on foot by those that were ambitious and covetous, or at the best blindly zealous, have always been opposed by the orthodox, even publicly, until the malicious industry of the greater part put to silence, though never quite overcame, the paucity of the better. so that their vaunting of the antiquity of their religion and the infancy of ours is vain and idle. And if they will glory, as usually they do, of the universality of their doctrine, because it was established forsooth by the Holy Ecumenical Council of Trent, as they term it, none can better judge than your Majesty how factious and how unlawful that assembly was, and by this history the whole world may understand the weakness of that foundation. The Almighty bless your Majesty with length of days, strength of body, loyalty of your people, and all unimaginable happiness in your most royal progeny, and in swaying the scepter of your dominions. Your sacred Majesty's most humble and most faithfully devoted servant, Nathaniel Brent. To the reader. Courteous reader, thou shalt see in this book greater variety of remarkable accidents than, before the reading of it, thou couldst have possibly imagined. The state of religion quite altered. In diverse kingdoms and countries of Christendom, the grandee is sometimes divided and armed one against the other, sometimes joined in confederations and leagues. The ecclesiastics oppressed, the Protestants persecuted, the bishops of Rome, as it were, acting their parts, and most lively deciphered in their natural colors. If learning will content thee, mark the disputations of the theologues and the deep discourses of the author himself. If policy will please thee, thou shalt find it in the consultations and treaties of the princes, managed with admirable dexterity by their ambassadors and ministers. And generally no delight will be wanting to thee, which thy curiosity may desire, or any other history afford. To consider above all in what a strange manner the conciliary acts of this assembly in Trent were carried. By reading those few words of thy countryman Edmund Campion below in this page, thou mayst perceive in what repute the papalists do hold it, and after, when thou hast read the book, thou wilt know how much it is overvalued. Compare thy judicious censure with his that is partial, and thou shalt find them to agree, as white with blackness, darkness with light. Farewell. Verba Edmundi Campiani rationi quarta redita academicis. Words of Edmund Campion and his fourth reason given to the universities. The Synod of Trent. The older it waxeth, the more it will flourish, good God. What variety of nations, what choice of bishops of the whole world, what splendor of kings and commonwealths, what marrow of theologues, what sanctity, what weepings, what fasts, what academical flowers, what languages, what subtleties, what labor, what infinite reading, what riches of virtues and studies did fill up that majestical sacred place. The most reverend Father and God, my singular good Lord, Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, His Grace, Primate of all England and Metropolitan, and one of His Majesty's most honorable Privy Councillor. Most reverend in Christ, it may seem strange, and I am sure it is without example, that one council only so large in history should be written and so full of all variety of matter. For in those of former ages in which the Holy Ghost did really and effectually assist the fathers, howsoever more prelates and divines were assembled from places more remote, and the actions guided by the greatest princes of all those times, yet nothing was attempted to increase or maintain the heresies and abuses that reigned then, nor was anything remarkable but the very doctrines and decrees themselves. But after that, the bishops of Rome, scorning to be ministers and servants, made themselves masters and monarchs of the Church of God. Practices and inventions of worldly men chafed away the heavenly inspirations of the blessed Spirit, and greater confusions and troubles that arise in the handling divine mysteries than did happen at any other time in negotiation in the affairs of kingdoms and of commonwealths. This hath ministered a whole ocean of occurrences and afforded a most copious subject to this present treatise. And so irresistible is the force of truth and divine providence, so great, that howsoever the Romanists have used all possible diligence to hinder the finding out of their unlawful proceedings in this council, by suppressing all public writings and monuments, which their treacheries and abuses might be discovered more plainly to the eyes of the world. The writing of this history, a man of admirable learning, exquisite judgment, indefatigable industry, and integrity scarcely to be matched, hath been raised up by God, who out of the diaries, memorials, registers, and other writings made and presented by the prelates and divines themselves, and by the ambassadors and princes of republics who were assistants herein, which are the most infallible grounds that any writer can have, hath revealed an infinite of intolerable abuses. As the proverb saith, cornicum oculos confixit. book I have translated out of Italian into our vulgar language, presuming to commend it to the royal protection of his sacred majesty, for whose sake, as some reasons induce me to believe, it was principally composed. Because I undertook this work at your grace's command, who have been the chiefest cause, why the original crossed the seas for the just nativity of it, and saw the first light within his majesty's dominions, as also in regard to the high place you most deservedly bear in the church of God, I thought it my duty to crave your favor likewise, that as the birth of it hath been happy by your grace's means, so the growth may accordingly proceed in the fruit of both, which is to remove an erroneous opinion of the infallibility of this pretended council, may constantly endure until the world's end. In publishing hereof, if my pen hath not merited such praise as others might, yet my desire to benefit God's church hath not been wanting. My zeal to serve your grace, in whatsoever I am able, shall never yield to any. And to whom I wish, for the public benefit of church and commonwealth, and for your own particular contentment, a perfect accomplishment of all your pious and honorable designs. Your grace is most obliged to your service, Nathaniel Brent. Judicious. History of the Inquisition. Performing with all due reverence the command laid on me by your highness to draw unto a head and set down in order all matters which concern the office of the Inquisition against heresy, I found all things so well ordered in times past by the councils of the most renowned commonwealth. There needeth no other thing to be done, but only to put together that which on diverse occasions hath been determined, bringing to pass that which was deliberated the most excellent council of 10, and in the year 1550, 22nd of November, the assistants shall not suffer the Inquisition to meddle in cases of usury. The Inquisition shall not in any case proceed against Jews or infidels. Behold here, most illustrious prince, the sum of all the aforesaid 9 and 30 chapters. Now resteth to show unto your highness the reason of them all. But first, that we may discourse more soundly, it will be needful for me to relate when, how, and for what cause the office of the Inquisition was instituted in Christendom, and at what time and in what form it was admitted to this famous city of Venice. Beginning therefrom, from thence I will say that although heresies by divine permission were sown in the world for the exercise and trial of good Catholics, even in those times as the Church began, after our Lord's Ascension, at the particular office of the Inquisition against heretics, did not begin till after the year 1200. Holy Apostles left for a remedy to this pestilence that the heretics should be admonished once or twice, and that perishing in his obstinacy, Catholics should separate themselves from his fellowship and excommunicate him. Nor was there any further proceeding until Constantine's time, who embraced the holy faith and was after imitated by his successors. And amongst other things, the saint taught princes that they should have two callings, the one of Christians, the other of princes, for bound in both of them to serve God as Christians, observing the divine precepts as every other private person, but as princes serving his divine majesty with well ordering of laws, and directing their subjects to piety, honesty, and justice, punishing all such as transgress the divine commandments, especially those of the Decalogue. For those that sin against the first table, which concerneth divine honor, are worse than they who sin against the second, which concerneth justice among men. Wherefore princes are more bound to punish blasphemies, heresies, and perjuries than murders and thefts. For this cause were diverse laws made against heresies, which are registered in the Justinian and Theodosian codes, imposing upon the guilty pecuniary mulcts, banishments, privation of part or of all their goods, according to the circumstances of the offense, the execution of the laws of which was committed to the secular officers. Every criminal judgment hath three parts: the cognizance of the cause of the delict, the cognizance of the fact, and the sentence. In the judgment for heresy, the cognizance of the reason is whether such an opinion be heretical or no. The cognizance of the fact is whether a person so accused or denounced hath defended or held or showed any token of holding that opinion. The sentence consisteth either in absolving the guiltless from an imputation or condemning him that he is found guilty. The first cognizance, what opinion is heretical, was always ecclesiastical. Neither can it any way belong to the secular powers, and when in those days there grew any difficulty upon some opinion, the emperors did require the judgment of bishops, and if need were, did call councils. But the cognizance of the fact whether the accused person were innocent or guilty, that he might have the punishment ordained by the laws, and the sentence of condemnation or absolution, it all belonged to the secular power. Some of the holy bishops and prelates of those times, after they had declared what opinions were heretical, and had separated from the churches, excommunicated and anathematized those that did hold them, intermeddled no further, nor durst give notice thereof to the magistrates, holding it to be no work of entire charity. Others, having perceived that fear of the secular magistrate did overcome the pertinency of the obstinate, and did work that which love of the truth could not do, held it as their duty to make known the heretical persons unto secular judges, and together with their erroneous opinions, and to excite them to put the imperial laws in execution. Because sometimes a heretic preacher did cause some notable trouble, and judges, regarding the sedition more than the heresy, did proceed also to capital punishments. The churchmen did, in these cases, forbear to appear before the tribunal, and did always use unfeigned exhortation to the judges, they should inflict no punishments of blood upon the delinquents. St. Martin in France excommunicated a bishop because he had accused certain heretics, to Maximus, usurper of the empire, which by him were put to death. St. Augustine, also most zealous of the purity of the Church, to clear it of this evil seed, did often and earnestly desire the proconsuls, counts, and other imperial ministers in Africa for to execute the prince's laws, and would make known unto them the places where heretics held their conventicles, and did discover the persons. But always when he saw any judge inclined to proceed against the life, he earnestly prayed him, by the mercies of God, by the love of Christ, and such like urging entreaties that he should desist from punishments of blood. In an epistle to Donatus, proconsul of Africa, tells him plainly that if he did persevere in punishing the heretics with the loss of their lives, and the bishop would forbear giving notice of them, and not being made known by others, they would rest unpunished, and the imperial laws unexecuted. Whereas proceeding mildly and without bloodshed, they would have been vigilant in discovering them and notifying of them the service of God and execution of laws. In this manner were things handled in the Church and causes of heresy under the Roman Empire until the year of our salvation 800, when the Eastern Empire being divided from the Western, this from rested in the Eastern until the end of it. In the Western the princes needed only make any laws, nor take much care about this business, seeing that for the space of 300 years, from 800 to 1100, there were very few heretics found in these parts, and when any case did it happen, which chanced but very seldom, the bishop did judge of it in the same manner as he proceeded against the ecclesiastical persons, as against infringers of the holy days, breakers of fasts, and such like, judging and punishing them by themselves. In those places where they had jurisdiction granted them by the princes, where they had not the like power, they did implore the secular aid to punish them. Sewing a cross of red cloth upon the garments of such as would dedicate themselves to such an action. Imposing the penalty of fire upon obstinate heretics, and upon penitent ones perpetual imprisonment. relationship is exhibited in the council between what men professed to believe and the interests they were actually concerned to promote particularly fascinated Sarpi, who frequently undertook to reveal the sordid purposes that protestations of high principle were designed to mask. His perception that men like to conceal interest under idealism found expression in neat and general aphorisms. How differently, Sarpi exclaimed, do men judge in what concerns their own interest from how they judge the affairs of another. So it happens not only in human things but also in those of religion. When interests change, credulity changes. The decay of political authority begun in the period of the barbarian invasions had gradually loosened all restraints on the clergy and left them a prey to their most worldly impulses. Growing materialism. Papal monarchy had been converted into an open tyranny by the claim of the Pope to stand above the canons that regulated the universal community of Christians. His position seems very close to that of Erasmus. He abominated any conception of Europe as a unified polity. He fully recognized that the continent was a system of states whose actions profoundly concerned one another, and his understanding of this system continued to be determined by the familiar Renaissance conception of balance. Sarpi's dislike of universalism, both political and ecclesiastical, was profound. For Sarpi, universality had never been more than a fantasy. Emperors of antiquity, he noted, in spite of the universal titles given them by courtesy, had ruled scarcely a tenth of the world. And the so-called general councils of antiquity had represented only the Christians of the empire, by no means the whole body of believers. To articulate and systematize religious belief was basically neither spiritual nor intellectual, but chiefly expressed only pride and malice. He regarded theological controversy because it degraded spiritual realities to the weak and corrupted level of man as a peculiarly offensive manifestation of human egotism. It seemed even worse than political ambition because it was mean and trivial. Similar to Edmund Burke. Ba-da-dee-dee-dun-dun-ba. Dun, 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 da-ya. Dee-da-da-da-dun, dee-da. Dun, dun, dun. Papal prohibitions against Catholic alliance with heretics he reputed as another recent innovation based on the political ambitions of Rome. He wrote frequently to Gallicans, as well as the Huguenots, of what might be hoped for from a great crusade in which, through an invasion of Italy, all anti-papal forces, Protestant as well as Catholic, would finally put an end to the temporal ambitions of Rome. If a general European conflict should turn out to be for the increase of God's glory and the advancement of the Church of God, then at least the purgation of the world, we should not complain. The multitude desires peace, but the wise would like war. Her libertarian traditions chiefly survived as a calculated permissiveness that made her in a city of pleasure the gaudiest stop on the grand tour of the European upper classes. In subsequent scholarship, Machiavelli and Florence stole the show. Venice was barely audible. Thousands of works on Machiavelli for every one on Sarpi. Cool. Now that was an exploration. Remained. Quran? Interesting. purpose of this book is to help the European reader to see the period of the Crusades from the other side, through the eyes and the minds of the men who, at that time, were the enemy. Such an experience is particularly interesting and informative in the case of the medieval conflict between Christianity and Islam, two civilizations which then had a great deal in common. It was their common struggle for universality that brought them into conflict and drove them to fanaticism. In fact, a sympathetic and conciliatory attitude to Islam is characteristic of Christians today, an attitude that may not be shared by the other side. We tend to still see the enemy of the Crusades in the light of that old theological and racial hatred. It is only in poetry that Clorinda is brought from the camp of Suleiman and Argantes to die reconciled with the faith. Christian swine has been substituted for Saracen dog.
Arab historians of the Crusades selected and translated from the Arabic sources by Francesco Gabrielli, translated from the Italian by E. J. Costello, translated from the Italian Storci Arabi del Croce, at first published in English in 1969 by Routledge and Kagan Paul plc. This edition RST published in 2010 by Routledge, 2 Park Square, Milton Park, Abingdon, Oxon, OX4. Arab Historians of the Crusades PDF, Arab The Crusades burst upon the Muslim Empire at a crucial moment in its history. The wave of Arab conquests had passed and Arab military activity was called to defense, while the Turks were still building up their military supremacy within the Muslim Empire before their great onslaught on the Christian world. Islam had already suffered at Christian hands during the Byzantine Wars, particularly during the 10th century, but this violent attack by the Latin Empire, on grounds that were fundamentally and conspicuously religious, took the Muslim world completely by surprise and found it in a state of political disunity that obstructed the speed and efficiency of its preparations for war. Grauset's formula, Initial Muslim Anarchy versus Frankish Monarchy, is an accurate summary of the situation in Syria during the last decade of the 11th century and the RST decade of the 12th. The land was divided among rival Turkish emirs, Seljuk Atabegs and their vassals. The Fatimids of Egypt maintained a tenuous control of Palestine. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph reigned under the tutelage of the Turkish Sultan, the dignity of his position emir, giving introduction shadow of what it had been in the days of Al-Mansur and Al-Mamun. The potentates of southern Syria and the Fatimid commanders in Palestine did their feeble best to put up a resistance, but the Crusaders spread like a stain through the empire, while the anti-crusade, vainly urged and hoped for by Baghdad, remained as ineffective as ever. During the 3rd and 4th decades of the 12th century, Muslim resistance stiffened as a result of the efforts of the Artukids of Mardin, Tu'udikin of Damascus and, in particular, Zangi and Nur ad-Din, Atabegs of Mosul. When the frontier county of Edessa fell to the Crusaders, Zangi turned his attention to Syria with the double aim of uniting it under his rule and driving the Franks back to the sea. Arabism as a political force was now of only secondary importance. The dynasties that led the counterattack were Turkish in race and in social and military organization. Although their culture was still Arabic, Saladin's rise to power in some ways interrupted and in others continued his movement toward Turkish supremacy. He was of Kurdish origin, educated in both the Turkish and the Arabic cultures, and profoundly orthodox in his faith and his way of life. He brought Egypt back to the path of orthodoxy as the center of his empire and gave Arabism new prestige. The two monarchs faced one another on the plain of Hidin, and the Latin crown of Jerusalem rolled in the dust. The Third Crusade succeeded in stemming the Muslim advance and propping up the tottering Christian states in Palestine. By the use of diplomacy and force, the Ayyubids Al-Adil and Al-Kamil maintained the equilibrium throughout the middle years of the century. They drove back the Fifth Crusade and kept Friedrich Otto within bounds, but they failed to mount an effective counter-offensive against the Christian states. This was left to the Mamluk sultans, Turkish slaves from southern Russia and the Caucasus, who by the middle of the 13th century had taken over the control of Egypt from the enfeebled Ayyubids. It was to these uncivilized soldiers, who perfected the system of military feudalism introduced by the Seljukids and continued by the Ayyubids, that Islam owed its deliverance both from the Mongol invasions. The victory at Anjalat in 1260 saved Syria, and from the Crusaders, the West could not maintain forever its Artisile empire across the Mediterranean. The papacy had diverted the lofty religious impulse of the RST Crusades to serve its own ends in the struggle for power in Europe, reducing the cross to a mere symbol on a ad-carried into battle against baptized Christians, in the crusade against the Albigenses and the war against the Hohenstaufen. Now it had to look on helplessly while Antioch, Tripoli and Acre fell one after the other and the Muslims now regained control of Palestine. The Templars' last stand in the Holy Land was also, unknown to them, a foretaste of the catastrophe that was to befall them in the West. These two eventful centuries, which brought the whole Christian world into conflict with Islam, although the Greek Church was the innocent victim of Western diplomatic errors, on territory that the Muslims had held for 100 years, are faithfully recorded by Muslim historians of this and the succeeding era. We have used the term Muslim because many of the authors are not Arabic by birth, but Arabic would be justiciable on the grounds of the language used. For the Persian historians and those few who had so far written in Turkish, add almost nothing to the history of the Crusades, or Arabo-Muslim on the grounds of the spirit that inspired them. Although the Arabic-speaking Christian historians of Egypt also had a part to play, the Frankish invasions, by which the Muslims meant invasions by European Christians as opposed to the Byzantine Rumi, in spite of the havoc and loss of life that they caused, introduction XV and the cost to Islam and the resistance that led up to the now victory, were never, for Muslim chroniclers, a single subject to be treated in isolation, although of the greatest importance to them. As to the West, they were always incorporated into the customary literary forms, given their place in annals recording general history, or used in the writing of biographies of the Muslim individuals or dynasties who set themselves up as champions of the faith. One would search Muslim historical writings in vain for a composite, species history of the wars against the Franks. Such a work can be composed, however, by juxtaposing and interweaving material from the various types of historical writing of the period. First come the general histories of the Muslim world, like Ibn al-Athir's classic work, lesser-known annals by Sit ibn al-Jawzi and Ibn al-Furat and later compilations. Next come chronicles of cities and regions, Ibn al-Kalanisis of northern Syria and Kamal ad-Dins of Mesopotamia, histories of regions and their dynasties like those of al-Makhrizi and Ibn Wasil and purely dynastic ones like Abu Shamas. Finally there are the biographies or records of the deeds of a certain person. Among these are the biographies of Saladin by Ahmad ad-Din and Baha ad-Din and the Afsil biographies of the RSD Mamluk Sultans by Ibn Abd az-Zahir. A unique work of the greatest historical and literary value is Usama's brilliant autobiography. The range of styles is wide. Some works are simply dry lists of events. Some are written in turgid rhymed prose, sage. Some are intelligent and accurate, others merely supercile compilations of unsubstantiated facts. What they have in common is, as one would expect, a scornful and hostile attitude toward the impious, fanatical infidels who invaded the territories of Islam. There are few analyses or discussions of the enemy's military aims. Polemics of this sort had only a brief popularity. During the peace negotiations of the Third Crusade, the presence of an armed enemy on Muslim soil could arouse only one response: the military reprisals enjoined by the Quran, which commands the faithful to press on into enemy territory until the foe is either exterminated or converted to the true faith. There could be no real peace. So, with the Franks or with any other infidel enemy, only a temporary truce. Hudna, when opportune or necessary, the celebrated peace, or truce, of 1192 between Richard and Saladin, was strongly opposed by many Muslims, in principle if not in fact. The 200 years of the Crusades could not have passed in continuous warfare. There were of course periods of truce, and even, in the 12th century, cases of unholy alliance between Muslims and Christians against the co-religionists of one side or the other. Ibn al-Kalanisi gives a frank account of the most scandalous of these alliances, that between the Franks and Damascus to block Zanghi's advance in 1140. Peace was not however the favorite subject of the Muslim historians, nor perhaps of any historian. Muslim accounts of the Crusades are endless, often merely monotonous. Descriptions of battles, skirmishes, ambushes, raids, slaughter, pillage and devastation are the most common words in the accounts of the Holy War. The names of the combatants change. Where the early historians describe the fall of the coastal cities of Syria to the Franks in a welter of blood and aim, 200 years later we can read of the same scenes, often in the same words but with the roles reversed. Qui Glaudio ferit Glaudio perit, although there is always admiration for valor and self-sacrifice, qualities to be found on both sides. The most intense conflicts of the 2 centuries took place during the Third Crusade, at Hadam and the Siege of Acre, when the opposing personalities were thrown into highest relief. The thing was more widespread and its implications more dramatic. The introduction monotonous military chroniclers sound almost inspired. Their accounts of daily life in the camp of Tiberius, of Ghts to the death under the walls of Acre, of marches and counter-marches at Saladin's command, have something of the atmosphere of religious epic. Equally important, though sometimes tiresomely detailed and confused, are their accounts of the long peace negotiations. It is a pity that the original text has not been preserved as Kalon's treaties were by the Mamluk historians. For 200 years Christianity and Islam, face to face in the Holy Land, were officially enemies bound to ceaseless warfare, interspersed only with precarious truces. This official attitude was accepted by the Muslim historians of the time and limited the range and depth of their approach. They reveal no interest in the social, economic or cultural organization of the Frankish states. Occasionally self-congratulation or contempt leads them to mention cases in which Islam's superior culture and way of life have made their mark on the enemy. For example, the case of the ruler of Shakif mentioned in biographies of Saladin. He spoke Arabic and studied literature and Islamic law, but the only use he made of his knowledge was to try to deceive the enemy. Saladin, that noble prince, punished him with nothing worse than imprisonment. The only hint to be found of interest in Frankish customs, ideas and way of life appears not in the serious histories but in the autobiography of the unprejudiced Usama. His accounts have not been forgotten in this volume. When medieval Muslims write of Christian beliefs or observances, they create a grotesque caricature. See for example a Mudhaddin on the fall of Christian Jerusalem, based on misconceptions that can only be equaled in Christian accounts of Islamic beliefs and practices. In this respect, each side gives as good as it gets, and the Crusades were totally ineffective as a means of
Totally ineffective.
the nobler aspects of the other's faith. It is also clear from the Muslim sources that what little exchange there was of men and ideas was almost always the result of Frankish initiative. William Attire, who learned Arabic and who wrote a history of the Orient, now lost from Arabic sources, had no parallel in the Muslim camp.
parallel.
The main interest of the Muslim historians is, naturally, their own side and its heroes. It is this aspect of their work, complementing the European sources, that is also of greatest interest to Western readers. In their opening chapters, the Arab historians give us frank and lucid discussions of the success of the First Crusade. There is a bitter passage in Kamel ad-Din accusing the rival emirs in Syria of blindly and selfishly welcoming the Frankish invasion and profiting by it. They greet with relief, although sometimes with reservations about the claims to legitimacy that were advanced. The rise of the great champions of the Muslim resistance, Tughtakin, Zangi, Muradin, Saladin, Damascus brave GHT against the besieging Franks, is the most distinguished example of resistance in open warfare by local and municipal troops. Not long after this, still in the RST stage of the war, Zangids, Ayyubids and Mamluks in succession took over the responsibility for controlling and unifying the defense, theoretically the duty of the Caliph in Baghdad. The Caliphate, already a mere shadow of its former self, disappeared altogether in the course of the Crusades, having done nothing more effective than issue pious exhortations and homilies, and messages of congratulation to the victorious champions of the faith. The annals of the anti-crusade are those of certain Muslim dynasties, Zangid, Mamluk and others, whose members carry the burden of the holy war for a variety of reasons, both religious and, introductions via political, and sometimes sacrificed their whole lives to the cause. It is understandable that their chroniclers, out of piety, gratitude and devotion to the dynasty, have been generous with their eulogies. Towering above them all, wringing admiration even from the enemy, is Saladin himself. His origins were obscure, his rise to power unorthodox and violent. He was destined to become the incarnation, for good or ill, of the power and prestige, and also the humanity and nobility, of the Oriental civilization of the Middle Ages. At the same time, he was an inexorably orthodox defender of its faith. The portrait of him drawn by Baha'u'ddin and Imad-Haddin, clearly that of the Muslim Optimus Princeps, is that of the pious leader rather than of a gallant knight, and it fails to explain the fascination that this man exerted on his contemporaries and successors, friends and enemies alike. But the legend which gives him a place in Dante's limbo and in so many tales and epics is not to be found in his own country, where the deeds of the less humane Baburs are more widely celebrated. There are vivid accounts in Muslim chronicles of both these heroes of the Islamic counter-offensive, as well as of Zangi, Muradin, Al-Kamil and other great defenders of Islam. Faithful characterization is one of the great merits of Muslim historians and is practiced, with other motives, in the brief but illuminating sketches of enemy leaders, Baldwin I's shrewdness, Richard Coeur de Lion's prowess in war, the indomitable energy of Conrad of Montferrat, Frederick II's diplomacy and skeptical irony, all were noted and independently commemorated by Muslim historians. Other judgments carry less authority. For example, the description of the saintly Louis Ix as a cunning rogue. Is it cunning to end a life of austere faith and quixotic idealism in a foolish expedition to Tunisia in the height of summer? Yet how vividly he springs to life, in all his dinny and affability, in Ibn Wassil's account of his conversation with an Egyptian plenipotentiary in the prison of Mansoura. The Arab histories of the Crusades compare favorably with their Christian counterparts in their rich accumulation of material and chronological information, although this is not always consistent either internally or with the dating given in European sources, and in their faithful characterization. We would not expect from them either serene impartiality in their attitude to the enemy, or originality and depth of understanding. The views expressed are those of medieval Muslim historians in general, alternating between pragmatism and mechanical, pietistic theology. One man stands out as a true historian from the ranks of more or less diligent chroniclers, Ibn al-Athir. His reputation among Orientalists has recently diminished because of the free and tendentious use he makes of his sources, but the qualities that reduce his reliability as documentary evidence are those of an original thinker, outstanding among so many passive compilers of facts. Although for this period the Arabs have no historian of the stature of William of Tyre, their general level of scholarship is probably higher than that of their Christian contemporaries. It is noticeable that the Arabs are for the most part more experienced in the techniques of their art and more professional in their approach. The reason for this has been mentioned. The Arab histories of the Crusades are usually only a section of a general historical panorama. This volume is by no means the RST attempt in the West to show the other aspect of the Crusades. More than a century ago, at the end of Michaud's Bibliothèque des Croisades, that great scholar Renoir, Michel Amari's teacher, produced a volume of Chroniques Arabes Paris, 1829, in which he strung together as a continuous narrative translations and Zvai introduction paraphrases of passages from various medieval Arab historians. They were taken from the manuscripts of the Bibliothèque du Roi, then almost entirely unedited. This pioneer work, which is still of use to the non-Arabist, was designed to give a coherent account of the Crusades from Arabic sources rather than to present those sources for their own sakes. This was also the aim of the section called Historiens Orientaux of the Great Recueil des Historiens des Croisades, published in the second half of the 19th century under the auspices of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres. Most of the Oriental section was edited by Barbier de Maynard, and the volumes published Paris, 1872-1906, contain extracts, in the original and in translation, of such historians as Ibn al-Athir, Abu Shama and Abu al-Fida. This imposing work is ill-adapted for reading as a continuous narrative, and has also been criticized for its choice of extracts and for errors in the text and the translations. Nevertheless, it remains a standard work of reference for both Orientalists and medievalists. This volume, a very modest work compared with either of these two, of course includes passages from both. Most of the excerpts, however, are taken directly from the original texts, nearly all of which have now been published or are available in the collection of photostats of historical manuscripts at the Fondation Académie pour l'Étude Musulmane in Rome. 17 authors are represented, certainly not an exhaustive list of all the Muslim sources for the Crusades, but including all the most important ones and as many as possible of the various types of historical literary writings mentioned earlier. The translation is inevitably fairly free, for a literal translation would be impossible to read easily for any length of time. The precise references given will enable Arabists to verify particular points, while acknowledging our debt to earlier translators, where they have existed, and apologizing for our inevitable errors. We hope that the best interpretation of these passages will be found here, based on emendations to the text that will easily be reconstructed by the specialist. The criteria of choice will be quite obvious: historical importance, human or literary interest in amusing or picturesque detail, without much historical importance perhaps, but the sort of vivid image that remains set in the memory, and is almost too appealing to Muslim historians and modern anthologists. The second section of the book, devoted to Saladin and the Third Crusade, is inevitably, by both these criteria, the largest. We hope that the book as a whole will give a picture of the period that is both clear in outline and accurate in detail, and that as far as space allows the author's characteristic styles will be revealed. I have come to the end of several months spent in the company of these Muslim historians of the Crusades, listening again to their arse and fanatical hostility to our ancestral faith, their zeal and love for their own faith and its traditions, and their admiration for the champions and martyrs who devoted themselves to its defense. I have studied the Muslim world for many years, but I must confess that never before have I experienced such a sympathetic comprehension and respect for a civilization whose faults and failings need no emphasis but which possessed inspiring qualities of endurance, dedication and self-sacrifice, amazing elasticity and powers of recuperation, and an unyielding faith in the absolute and supreme law. When qualities such as these are shown by an enemy, they, introductions tend to be described in terms of their associated defects. It is time for us, without either denying our own faith or shirking the facts, to give them the name they deserve. Rome, September 1957. In this second edition, certain errors have been corrected and the bibliography brought up to date. June 1963. Francesco Gabrielli. The authors and works Ibn al-Qalanisi one Abu Ya'la Hamza Ibn Asadat Tamimi, known as Ibn al-Qalanisi, Damascus, c. 465/1073 555/1160. He is the earliest Arab historian to write about the Crusades, in his chronicle known as Dayl Tarik Dimashq, appendix to the history of Damascus, referring to a chronicle of that title by Hilal as-Sabi. This work, which is attached to as-Sabis in a single MS, covers the period 363/974-555/1160, the year of the author's death, and deals to some extent with the history of Mesopotamia, but GY of Syria and Damascus, where Ibn al-Qalanisi held various municipal and administrative posts. He writes from first-hand experience of the First and Second Crusades up to the time of Nur ad-Din's entry into Damascus. The narrative is circumstantial and accurate, showing a certain partiality for Tudikin's dynasty in Damascus. The style is dry and objective, apart from a few chapters in more stylized prose. His objectivity about most matters, his eyewitness accounts of events through which he lived, and his use of documents make Ibn al-Qalanisi's chronicle a basic source for the RST period of the Crusades. Text, Amadras edition, Leiden, 1908. Ibn al-Athir Izz-ad-Din Ibn al-Athir, Jazirat Ibn Umar, 555/1160 Mosul 630/1233, came of a Mesopotamian family and is the most famous of three brothers, all well known to Muslims of Arabic education. His most important work is Kamil at-Tariq, The Perfect History, or the Collection of Histories, an enormous history of the whole Muslim world from Arabic and Hebrew legends and the history of pre-Muhammadan times to the year 628/1231. For the earlier period, to the beginning of the 10th century AD, he reproduces for the most part a Tabari's great collection, but for the last 3 centuries and in particular for his own period, the breadth and balance of his statements, the wealth of material collected, and above all his robust and personal view of history make him a very important source. Some would call him the only real Arab historian of the period. This marked individuality is also the cause of his defects as an author, a tendency sometimes to favor the Zangi dynasty, Zangi, Nur ad-Din and their successors, inaccurate chronology, and sometimes a certain lack of respect for his sources. But with these reservations, one can only admire the unity of a work that embraces the whole Muslim world from Transoxiana to the farthest one. The order of these notes, which in all cases but the RST corresponds to that in which the authors appear in the book, is only roughly related to their chronological order. The authors and works 23 Maghreb and Spain, one in which the author seeks to trace the causal links of events, and is able to overcome the difficulties of the analyst's technique and present his facts clearly and convincingly. For his history of the Crusades, Ibn al-Athir was an eyewitness, although not always a sympathetic one, of Saladin's career, and made use of Ibn al-Qalanisi, Ghayr ad-Din and Imad ad-Din as sources. The clarity and simplicity of his style, which avoids archaisms and embellishments and aims at presenting the essential facts, has contributed to his reputation as the chief historian of the later Crusades. Text: Tauernberg's edition, volumes, X, Zi, Leiden, 1853-64, Camel Adin Camel Adin Ibn Aladdin, Aleppo 588/1192, Cairo 661,262, was the historian of his native city, in particular in an enormous biographical work, not yet published in modern times, Bayat at-Talib, The Student's Desire, of which only a part remains, and also in a history of the city, Zubdat al-Haleb Tariq Haleb, The Cream of the Milk in the History of Aleppo, based on material collected for the larger work and extending to 641/1243. This work is for Aleppo of the 12th and 13th centuries, what Ibn al-Qalanisi chronicled as for 12th century Damascus. Its value to historians of the Crusades is as an Arabic account of the events in northern Syria. Text: Sami Danin's edition, II, Damascus, 1954, Usama Usama Ibn Munkid, Amir of Shazer 488/1095, Damascus 584/1188, is one of the most interesting of the Syrian Arabs living during the Crusades, a man of action and a writer, horseman and huntsman, lover of books and courtier, and an unscrupulous political intriguer. He spent most of his long life in contact with the Franks, the emirs of Syria and the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt, but in the end died in obscurity at the height of Saladin's triumphs. He owes his reputation to his autobiography Kitab al-Itibr, Book of Instruction with Illustrations, which has come down to us in an incomplete MS in the SQ. It is a sincere if rather verbose self-portrait, and his storehouse of anecdotal information about his Muslim and Frankish contemporaries. Only fragments of the rest of his rich literary production are preserved, among them the Kitab al-Asa, the Book of the Stick, a collection in the traditional Arabic manner of anecdotes, rhymes, sayings and proverbs on the subject of sticks. The last of our selections from his work is taken from this book. Text: Derenborg's edition, Paris, 1886. And for the last example, H. Derenborg, Asamu Ibn Munkid, Un Amir Sirino Premier Siècle des Croisades, I, Paris, 1893, pages 528-29. The authors and works Balhu Adid Baha Adin Ibn Shaddad, Mosul 539/1145-632/1234, entered Saladin's service in 1188, was made Cadi to the army and remained a faithful member of the Sultan's household until Saladin's death. Under his immediate successors he was Grand Cadi of Aleppo. His biography of the Sultan, An-Nadir as-Sultani wa al-Mahazin al-Yusufiyya, Sultanly Anecdotes and Josephly Virtues, Joseph being Saladin's personal name, is an excellent historical and biographical source, dictated by sincere devotion and admiration unmixed with servile addery and based for the most part on personal observation. The style is simple and free from literary affectations. Bayat gives us the most complete portrait we have of Saladin as the Muslims saw him, and a vivid chronicle of the Third Crusade. Text: In Recueil des Historiens des Croisades, Historiens Orientaux, 3, Paris, 1884, imitated in Imad al-Bahani, Asfahan 519/1125, Damascus 597/1201, was secretary to Nur ad-Din and to Saladin, whose chancellor he was under the Cadi al-Fadil. He was a scholar and a rhetorician to the marrow and left a valuable anthology of 12th century Arabic poetry as well as various historical works, written from start to finish in the most ornate and arty style of which the language is capable, blank and rhyming verse, uninterrupted sequences of alliteration, metaphors and puns. This difficult and tedious literary form soon led other anthologists such as Abu Shama, see below, to give the gist of Imad-Din's history elsewhere, but there are facts of vital historical importance not included in these synopses for which we must go back to the original, preserved and published in the same volume is Imad-Din's History of the Fall of Jerusalem, which extends as far as Saladin's death. Al-Fath al-Qudsi, which might be translated Ciceronian eloquence on the conquest of the Holy City, puns and do their way even into the title. We also have a part, still unedited, of the Bark Ash-Shami, or Lightning of Syria, which chronicles Saladin's life and deeds from 1175. In these two works modern research is revealing, beneath the impossible style, an important source for Saladin's career and for events in Syria and Mesopotamia, in which Imad ad-Din was a protagonist and which he describes circumstantially, accurately and faithfully. We have, however, to contend with the fact, clearly revealed in the passages chosen, that the concrete details are almost lost in an appalling mass of verbiage.
An appalling mass.
Landmark's edition, Leiden, 1888. Abu Shama Shihab ad-Din Abu al-Qasim Abu Shama, Damascus 599-120. 665-1267, was a philologist, teacher and industrious anthologist. His Kilabar ad-Din,
That's what I am, an industrious anthologist.
Dynasties of Saladin and Nur ad-Din, brings together valuable material, for most of which we also have his original sources. He quotes, giving his references, from Ibn al-Qalanisi, Imad ad-Din, reduced to a more sober and endurable style, Bar ad-Din, Ibn al-Athir and others. More important to us are his quotations from the authors and works XXV Shiite historian of Aleppo, Ibn al-Battai, among other things the author of a biography of Saladin. The Two Gardens also reproduces numerous documents from the Sultan's chancellery, most of them from the chief secretary, individual collections of whose letters also exist. Text, Cairo 1287/1870. Manakib Rashid ad-Din. We use this name to refer to a writer of the Ismailite sect in Syria, the Assassins. The Virtues of Our Lord Rashid ad-Din, as the full title of his work may be translated, is a collection of recollections and anecdotes about the great master Rashid ad-Din Sinan, a contemporary of Saladin and thus leader of the sect in Syria at the time of Saladin's greatest power. These records, in which Edikatayan is given a much more important place than historical information, were collected in 1324 by an obscure follower of the sect, Sheikh Abu Fayrus of Ma'inaka, at a time when the influence of the Ismailites was on the wane. The passage translated here appears, under its cloak of legend, to be an account of the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat. Text, Journal of Shiatique Series Vin I, IX, 1877, pages 324-489, Esquiyard, on Grand Maitre des Assassins au Temps du Saladin, Ibn Wasil Jamal ad-Din Ibn Wasil, Hamid 604/1207/697/1298, held several of says under the last Ayyubids and early Mamluks. In 1261 he went as Babur's ambassador to Manfred, and ended his career as Grand Cadi of his native city. His greatest work, Mufaraj al-Qurab Akbar Bani Arab, the dissipator of anxieties concerning the history of the Ayyubids, is
The dissipator of anxieties.
But RST deals with the history of the Zangids, and after Saladin with the Mamluks up to 681,282. It is therefore one of the best sources for the 13th century Crusades. The Fifth Crusade, Frederick II's Journey, St. Louis Crusade, later anthologists have drawn from it. It has long remained unpublished, for no good reason, and in addition is only now underway. One text, Ms. Paris R 1702, photostat from the Kidani collection. Sit Ibn al-Jawzi, the grandson, Sit, of an earlier chronicler. Ibn al-Jawzi was a famous preacher who lived for most of his life in Damascus as a friend of the Ayyubid princes. Baghdad 582/1186, Damascus 654/1256. His enormous and prolix universal history, Mirat az-Zaman, the Mirror of the Times, of which two versions have come down to us, is particularly important. 3 volumes, edited by M. Sha'al, Cairo 1954-62, have so far appeared XV the authors and works because of the period of the author's life in the course of Syrian history at that time. It is to this work, for example, that we owe the fascinating details of Frederick's visit to Jerusalem, as well as some illuminating details of the siege of Damascus by the Crusaders a century before. Text, a partial edition by Jewett, Chicago, 1907, covering the years of the Hijra 495-654, for the siege of Damascus. See a note in Amadraw's edition of Ibn al-Qalanisi, Tariq Manshuri the Chronicle, taking us up to 631/1233, of an obscure functionary of the Ayyubid princes of Syria, a certain Abu al of Hamid, dedicated to Al-Malik al-Mansur, Amir of Hims, from whom the title comes, A Man Should Write History. Its importance lies in the facts it gives about Frederick I in the Holy Land, and the end of the Muslims in Sicily as described by Sicilian Arabs who came to Syria as emissaries and refugees. These valuable fragments, from the Asiatic Museum in Petersburg, were edited by Amari. Text, in Bibliotheca Arabo-Sicula, 2nd Appendix, Leipzig, 1887. IBN Abd Aziz Zahir Mihai Adnan IBN Abd Azahir, Cairo 620/1233-692/1293, was secretary to the Mamluk Sultans Baybars and Kilan, compiler of their official acts of chancellery and later their biographer, drawing on the material he had collected. Parts of Babur's biography, Sirat al-Malika Zahir, still exist, and so does the anthology edited by his nephew Shah al-Asqalani. The greater part of the biography of Kilan is to be found in the anonymous Tashrif al-Ayyam wa al-Yusra bi Sirat as-Sultan al-Malik al-Mansur, The Honoring of the Years and the Days, through the life of the Sultan al-Malik al-Mansur. Ibn Abd az-Zahir also wrote a life of Kilan's son al-Ashraf, conqueror of Acre, of which a fragment has been published. The rest of this author's work is so far unedited, despite his importance as a contemporary and witness of the events narrated and a transmitter of precious official documents, letters, treaties, etc. Naturally, his obsequious attitude to his masters makes it necessary to use his information with caution. Text, Shah's Anthology of the Life of Baybars, Ms. Paris R 1707, and Tashrif, Life of Kilan, Ms. Paris R 1704, photostat from the Kidani collection. CIBN Abd az-Zahir, Tashrif Makrizi Taki Adnan al-Makrizi, Cairo 776/1334-845/1442, a great scholar and antiquarian, collected valuable material on the historical topography of Egypt. His importance for our period lies in one of his historical works which is almost entirely compiled from other the authors and works Xvi writers, Ibn Wasil, Sit Ibn al-Jawzi, Ibn Abd az-Zahir and other lesser-known sources, but which is indispensable in our present state of knowledge, his Kitab as-Sulak Ma'rifat Tariq al-Mulik, the book of proceeding to the knowledge of the history of the kings, which includes Ayyubid Mamluk history from 577/1181 to 840/1436. It therefore covers the two Frankish expeditions to Egypt and the Mamluks' now victory in Syria. Text, MCI 8th edition, Cairo, 1934, IBN al-Furat Nasir ad-Din IBN al-Furat, Cairo 735/1334-807/1405, was, like Makrizi and almost all his contemporaries, a great anthologist whose importance depends on that of the sources transcribed by him. His great Tariq ad-Dawla al-Mulik, the history of the dynasties and the kings, of which parts of an unpublished MS are in existence, brings us up to the end of the 14th century and contains interesting material on the early Mamluks. Another long recognized value of Ibn al-Furat, as of Abu Shama, is his quotations from the lost Ibn al-Battai on Saladin's life and times. Text, Vinar 814 AF, volumes, VI, photostat from the Kidani collection. Al-Aini Badr ad-Din Al-Aini, Aintab 762/1360, Cairo 855/1451, was a Mamluk of Silent Courtier as well as a philologist and student of Hadith. He also compiled a general history, Iqd al-Juman Tariq al-Azaman, the necklace of pairs concerning the history of the people of the time, which is usually consulted for sources not yet attributed to known authors or directly accessible. Text, recoiled as historians des Croisades, Historiens Orientox, II, Paris, 1887. Abu al-Fitna Imad Hadin Ismail ibn Ali al-Ayyubi, the Abu Fida of 18th and 19th century Arabists, is a sympathetic Jew, an Amir who is also a man of letters, rather in the style of Usama. He was a member of the Ayyubid house after it had lost all autonomous power, supplanted in Syria and Egypt by the Mamluks, and he succeeded in getting them to recognize his rights to Hamid, where he ruled with the title of al-Malik al-Mu'ayyad until his death. His two main literary works, the history, Mukhtasar Tariq al-Bashar, Historical Compendium of the Human Race, and the Geography, Taqwim al-Baldan, Determination of the Longitude of the Lands, happen to be among the RST works of Arabic literature to be known and partially edited in Europe since the beginning of the modern Arabist movement here. This led at RST to an overestimation of the value of these two anthologies, which have been almost supplanted by the older originals discovered since then. The section of the history dealing with the author's own lifetime retains its interest. He saw service as a young man at the fall of Tripoli and Acre, and so was an eyewitness of the tragic ending of the Crusades, i.e. the authors in works text, recoiled as historiens des croisades, historiens orient talks, I, Paris, 1872, Abu al-Mahazin IB in Tagliberdi, Cairo 813/1411-874/1469, was also one of the group of soldiers and scholars who washed in the Mamluk era. His great history of Egypt, Anushim al-Zahir and Mulik Nisawal al-Kahira, the shining stars concerning the kings of Egypt and Cairo.
Shining stars.
Chronicle of Egyptian history until 857/1453. It is, however, entirely an anthology of other men's works. His account of the siege and conquest of Acre under al-Athraf, from a contemporary source, when compared with that of Abu al-Fidl, is the most interesting Muslim account of the event known to us. In the published fragment of Ibn Abd az-Zawhi's biography of the Sultan, there is no reference to this event. Chapter 1. Our main sources for the First Crusade: Ibn al-Qalanisi of Damascus and the Mesopotamian Ibn al-Athir, whereas Ibn al-Qalanisi limits himself to a chronological list of events. Ibn al-Athir relates the various stages of the Crusade to the whole picture of Christian uprisings against Islam, beginning with the reconquest of Spain and the Norman invasion of Sicily. He gives the most complete and convincing, if not the most strictly factual, account of the fall of Antioch and Jerusalem, the establishment of Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land, and the RST Muslim attempts at retaliation. The Franks seize Antioch. Ibn al-Athir, X. 185-8. The power of the Franks RST became apparent when in the year 478/1085-86 they invaded the territories of Islam and took Toledo and other parts of Andalusia. As was mentioned earlier,
Islam.
in 484/1091 they attacked and conquered the island of Sicily and turned their attention to the African coast. Certain of their conquests they were won back again, but they had other successes, as you will see. In 490/1097 the Franks attacked Syria. This is how it all began. Baldwin, their king, to a kinsman of Roger the Frank who had conquered Sicily, assembled a great army and sent word to Roger saying, "I have assembled a great army and now I am on my way to you, to use your bases for my conquest of the African coast. Thus you and I shall become neighbors." Roger called together his companions consulted them about these proposals. This will be a net thing both for them and for us, they declared, for by this means these lands will be converted to the faith of this. Roger raised one leg and farted loudly, and swore that it was of more use than their advice. One, why? Because if this army comes here it will need quantities of provisions and eats of ships to transport it to Africa, as well as reinforcements from my own troops. Then, if the Franks succeed in conquering this territory they will take it over and will need provisioning from Sicily. This will cost me my annual parity from the harvest. If they fail they will return here and be an embarrassment to me here in my own domain. As well as all this time, and who will say that I have broken faith? This date clearly refers to the end of the Norman conquest. This Baldwin, Bardon, is a mythical character, compounded of the various Baldwins of Flanders and Jerusalem, or else the RST Baldwin is mistakenly thought to have been already a king in the West. It is disagreeable to envy the great count acting like a barbarian on the very RST page, but the passage is characteristic of the contemptuous crudity with which the Muslims usually spoke of their enemies, as well as giving a fairly accurate picture of Roger's political acumen. Wazir Amir of Tunisia, Tamim Ibn Mayes 1212 Part 1, from Godfrey to Saladin III with him and violated our treaty, and friendly relations and communications between us will be disrupted. As far as we are concerned, Africa is always there. When we are strong enough we will take it. He summoned Baldwin's messenger and said to him, if you have decided to make war on the Muslims your best course will be to free Jerusalem from their rule and thereby win great honor. I am bound by certain promises and treaties of allegiance with the rulers of Africa. So the Franks made ready and set out to attack Syria. Another story is that the Fatimids of Egypt were afraid when they saw the Seljukids extending their empire through Syria as far as Gaza, until they reached the Egyptian border and Axis III invaded Egypt itself. They therefore sent to invite the Franks to invade Syria and so protect Egypt from the Muslims, for the God knows best. When the Franks decided to attack Syria they marched east to Constantinople, so that they could cross the straits and advance into Muslim territory by the easier land route. When they reached Constantinople, the Emperor of the East refused them permission to pass through his domains. He said, unless you RST promise me Antioch, I shall not allow you to cross into the Muslim Empire. His real intention was to incite them to attack the Muslims, for he was convinced that the Turks, whose invincible control over Asia Minor he had observed, would exterminate every one of them. They accepted his conditions and in 490/1097 they crossed the Bosphorus at Constantinople. Iconium and the rest of the area into which they now advanced belonged to Kilij Arslan ibn Sulayman ibn Qulamish, who barred their way with his troops. They broke through one in Rajab 490/July 1097, crossed Cilicia, to and nearly reached Antioch, which they besieged. Agisian, the ruler of Antioch, heard of their approach. He was not sure how the Christian people of the city would react, so he made the Muslims go outside the city on their own to dig trenches, and the next day sent the Christians out alone to continue the task. When they were ready to return home at the end of the day he refused to allow them. Antioch is yours, he said, but you will have to leave it to me until I see what happens between us and the Franks. Who will protect our children and our wives, they said. I shall look after them for you. So they resigned themselves to their fate, and lived in the Frankish camp for 9 months, while the city was under siege. Yagisian showed unparalleled courage and wisdom, strength and judgment. If all the Franks who died had survived they would have overrun all the lands of Islam. He protected the families of the Christians in Antioch and would not allow a hair of their heads to be touched. After the siege had been going on for a long time the Franks made a deal with one of the men who were responsible for the towers. He was a cuirass maker called Ruz, the one whom they bribed with a fortune in money and lands. He worked in the tower that stood over the riverbed, where the river owed out of the city into the valley. The Franks sealed their pact. A general of the Seljukid Sultan Maliksha, who in 1076 attacked Egypt from Palestine. Of course the Fatimids were also Muslims, but they were heretics and so opposed to the rest of Sunni Islam. At Dorylaeum, literally the land of the son of Armenis, as the Arab writers call the Lesser Armenia of the Cilician Rapinians. Firaz is an alternative reading 341214. Arab historians of the Crusades with a cuirass maker, goddamn him, and made their way to the water gate. They opened it and entered the city. Another gang of them climbed the tower with ropes. At dawn, when more than 500 of them were in the city and the defenders were worn out after the night watch, they sounded their trumpets. Yagisian woke up and asked what the noise meant. He was told that trumpets had sounded from the citadel and that it must have been taken. In fact, the sound came not from the citadel but from the tower. Panic seized Yagisian and he opened the city gates and ed in terror, with an escort of 30 pages. His army commander arrived arrived, but when he discovered on inquiry that Iagisirion had fled, he made his escape by another gate. This was of great help to the Franks, for if he had stood for an hour, they would have been wiped out. They entered the city by the gates and sacked it, slaughtering all the Muslims they found there. This happened in Jamada I, 491 April May 1098.2 as for Iagisirion. When the sun rose he recovered his self-control and realized that Izide had taken him several farsakhs from the city. He asked his companions where he was, and on hearing that he was 4 farsakhs from Antioch he repented of having rushed to safety instead of staying to GHT to the death. He began to groan and weep for his desertion of his household and children. Overcome by the violence of his grief he fell fainting from his horse. His companions tried to lift him back into the saddle, but they could not get him to sit up, and so left him for dead while they escaped. He was at his last gasp when an Armenian shepherd came past, killed him, cut off his head and took it to the Franks at Antioch. The Franks had written to the rulers of Aleppo and Damascus to say that they had no interest in any cities but those that had once belonged to Byzantium. This was a piece of deceit calculated to dissuade these rulers from going to the help of Antioch. The Muslim attack on the Franks, and its results, Ibn al-Athir, X. 188-90. When Qaim ad-Dawla Kerbukuan heard that the Franks had taken Antioch, he mustered his army and advanced into Syria, where he camped at Marjadabik. All the Turkish and Arab forces in Syria rallied to him except for the army from Aleppo. Among his supporters were Dukak